The Chronicles of the Crisis, the series. The Legend of the Destruction of Mankind. Part 1. Technicalities. About a month has passed since the incident. Tensions have not increased, but they haven't exactly gone down either. The duat is in a precarious state, and just one wrong move might tip the scales. As the distance between the gods grows, so too does the distance between them and their followers. The mortals have not been informed of Osiris' murder, but they're not stupid. They know something is up. The beloved King Osiris is nowhere to be seen, and upon his throne sits his great-grandfather, Ra. The old sun god is doing his best to manage the duat on top of managing the sun, though his patience is wearing thin. His early morning, late evening, and all of the night are spent on the sun barge, guiding the Atet through the sky. It is only in the heat of the day, when the Atet can float across the sky on its own, that the old griffin can get any rest. And rest is a hard thing to come by for a king. While the mortals may be disgruntled with their new, or rather old, king, Ra's children and grandchildren at least respect his authority. This is especially true for Sekhmet, who has taken it upon herself to act as Ra's muscle and guard the palace alongside the flesh-eaters. Her brother Sobek has pulled back his influence to just the Nile itself, as his powers of fertility are needed now more than ever with Osiris gone. Thoth has not reappeared since Osiris' death. Fearing Set's wrath, the blind seer has retreated down the Nile towards the marshlands. He remains in hiding there, only occasionally touching base with Sobek when the crocodile god happens to enter the area. Dissent has also spread among the other deities in the pantheon. Equally powerful, though less influential gods, have sprung up from Ra's lineage over the millennia. Some of them, such as the sisters Anat and Astarte, are even younger than Osiris and his siblings. They were all quite quick to take sides in the gradually widening divide in the pantheon. While the lowest deities, the flesh-eaters, might be content to allow for this unplanned shift in power, others, like the fierce sisters Sekhmet and Wadjet, view it as a potential opportunity to increase their own power. Tensions are highest, however, between the remnants of the Big Four. Or, well, the three now. As the end of the month approaches, Isis can no longer bring herself to reside in the palace. Everything she sees in there reminds her of what happened, of what she did wrong, of what she could have done, and of her growing hatred for her vile brother. She and Nephthys have taken up residence together in a small shrine at the edge of the palace grounds, where the mortals would normally come to drop off offerings in the mornings. It isn't very extravagant, but it's still shelter, and close enough to home to not feel too strange. Isis didn't ask Nephthys to come with her. In fact, the sorrow goddess kind of invited herself in. Not that Isis really minds. She really could use the help digging herself out of a mental pit. While the former queen of the duat had considered heading down into the marshlands like Thoth had, she knew she couldn't simply abandon her husband's throne. Not when the other gods were so eager to take power. While the throne was rightfully hers, Ra had still stripped her of that title in order to preserve the peace. Isis had to remain strong, lest she lose what remnant she still had of Osiris. Nephthys had been by her side since the beginning. The sorrow goddess is quiet. These events have been traumatizing for her too, after all, but she's still dutiful. Without her around, Isis might quite literally forget to eat. Of course, Nephthys' presence has also brought some unwanted attention. At least it's unwanted in Isis' eyes. As to be expected, Set is quite frustrated with their current predicament too. And while he wouldn't openly tell anyone, he's ashamed too. He's tried paying the sisters' hiding place a visit several times by now. Contrary to what Isis might think, he isn't there to cause trouble. He just wants to speak with his wife. Understandably, she doesn't let him in, leaving Set to have to try to talk to a door on more than one occasion. he knows he screwed up. He knows this is all his fault, and he just wants to apologize for it. But she won't even give him the opportunity. She doesn't trust him anymore. No one does. The story of Osiris' murder has passed amongst all of the rest of the gods. Everywhere Set goes, whispers of his mistake, his crime, follow him. Even Ra, the one who saved him from being put to death for his actions, watches him like a hawk. He's stripped Set of his duties on the Sun Barge too, leaving the workaholic dark deity completely without a job. Now Set doesn't even have his work to take his mind off of what he's done, though he guesses that he probably deserves it. He deserves some kind of punishment, doesn't he? Is it enough? Would any punishment ever be enough? Maybe Isis had a point. Maybe he should be put to death. Or maybe staying alive to live with his actions was a worse punishment than death. Today isn't so bad. Isis actually got out of bed this morning, and right now she's counting whatever little successes she can come up with. As the sun rises on a new day, mortals begin to visit the cramped little shrine she and her sister reside in. They come bringing offerings for the gods, something which Isis and Nephthys gladly take their share of. Isis emerges from her makeshift bedroom just as Nephthys is bringing in some of the ritual loaves and libation jars. Her sister is elated to see her up at a reasonable time, and the two of them sit down to have a bite to eat. Their new diet isn't exactly the most luxurious of menus, but it was better to remain safe than to risk the possible conflicts that venturing back into the palace might bring. "I'm glad to see you're eating again," Nephthys tells Isis, and she encouragingly pushes over another basket to her sister. "I was starting to get worried." "I'm still not sure what to do with myself," Isis admits. "But I know I should be taking better care of myself. I need to keep my strength up." "That's okay. Just leave the sorrow business to me, alright?" says Nephthys. "Was that a joke?" Isis chuckles. It wasn't really like her normally timid sister to be so forward with her. "Sorry, was that too much?" the sorrow goddess quickly apologizes, earning another snicker from Isis. No, I appreciate it," she assures, smiling warmly at her. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Nephthys." Talking things out is good. Nephthys isn't that used to being the responsible one out of the two of them, so she's also happy to see that Isis is taking charge again. Isis is simply glad that she still has her sister with her after everything that happened. She doesn't like that Set is still around, but she definitely appreciates that Nephthys has sided with her and everything instead of her husband. They need to stick together if they're going to make it through this, after all. Speaking of which, while the two girls are talking things out and enjoying their meal, they hear a knock at the door. Nephthys turns her head to look at it, while Isis only scowls. She thinks it might be Set again, and warns Nephthys not to open the door. Nephthys gives a little nod, and she goes quiet for a few moments. In a hushed tone, she admits that sometimes she does want to open the door and talk, if only to hear why Set could have brought himself to do such a thing. Isis wants to point out that this is a bad idea, but she sees the pain in her sister's eyes. Her scowl softens a little, and she apologizes to her for once. Keeping her voice low, so as to avoid catching the ear of their visitor, she says that it's good to talk things out, and that Nephthys has lost her husband just as much as Isis has lost hers. She says that, right now, things are a little too dangerous to risk letting Set just walk in here. But she'll help her figure things out in the future. It's the least she can do for all of Nephthys' loyalty, after all. Nephthys seems taken aback by this, and she begins to thank her sister. That is, until they hear a noise. "Hello?" comes a desperate, small voice. Through their conversation, the knocking had continued, growing more and more urgent. And that small voice? That isn't Set. Please, please help me, it pleads. Whoever they were, they must have heard the sisters whispering. Of course, they hadn't been expecting that. Nephthys turns her head to look at the door again, while Isis is already rising from her seat. She makes her way over to the door and opens it, with her sister curiously coming up behind her. As they open the door, a comparatively small mortal man proceeds to flop down against the stone. Immediately visible to the two goddesses is the fact that he's absolutely covered in blood, and he's sporting some nasty gashes on his torso. Without hesitation, the sisters bring him in. With Isis's healing magic and Nephthys' skills, a mortal life is saved. But he brings news of death. The sisters ask him what happened. Isis begins to worry that Set is wreaking havoc again. But she doesn't voice the suspicion. She has to keep Nephthys' feelings in mind, after all. Contrary to the Queen Goddess's assumption, however, her brother has nothing to do with it. As the mortal recounts his tale of being attacked, the first godly name out of his mouth is Sekhmet. Apparently, he and some other mortals had been minding their business in the heart of the city when the lioness goddess had just suddenly descended upon them. When pressed further about her story, the mortal admits that he and his companions may have been complaining to each other about Ra's new leadership over the land. The mortal insists they hadn't said anything insulting, of course, just that they missed the old good king, Osiris, and they wished that the crotchety old griffin could be as kind, personal, and understanding as the youthful, strong Osiris. Well, there was his problem. Isis assures the mortal that she understands their feelings. She doesn't admit that Osiris is dead, of course, but she expresses sympathy and says that she misses him too. She also, however, points out that Ra is working as hard as he can, and while he may be old and worn, he's wiser than all the rest of the gods put together. The mortals should still respect his authority, even if they liked Osiris better. The mortal man goes on to relay that Sekhmet's rage had not stopped there. What had begun as a vengeful attack against her father's naysayers had quickly devolved into a bloodbath. The lioness goddess had lashed out against the first mortal and his companions, but moved on to menacing any innocent bystanders that were nearby. Even if they hadn't said anything against Ra, their proximity made them guilty by association in her eyes. When the girls ask him if Sekhmet is still out there rampaging, the mortal says he doesn't know, that he barely got away himself, and that most of the people around him were already dead. He had known the goddesses were close by, however, and he came to them because he hoped they could stop the lioness. Nephthys looks to Isis urgently, but the queenly goddess seems to have made up her mind already. "We'll take care of it," she promises the mortal, rising back to her feet. There's only one other god that Sekhmet answers to, and that's her father. They need to speak with Ra. As soon as they're sure the mortal can return home safely, Isis and Nephthys make their way across the courtyard to the main palace. For them, it's only a short walk, but it still feels like a long journey. The palace interior isn't home anymore, after all. Before Isis can even open the doors, she and Nephthys can hear very angry shouting from within. The sisters reach the throne room. Isis stops in the doorway, however, when she sees who's skulking around inside. Set, looking more agitated than ever, is pacing around the area beneath the throne like a caged animal, and growling like one too. Ra, meanwhile, remains seated on his throne, calmly trying to talk down his agitated grandson. Isis watches this for a moment, debating with herself about whether or not she should interrupt them. Behind her, Nephthys gives her a light push, as if to urge her forward. Isis looks back to her sister, trying to read the expression on her face. While Set himself might still be a threat to them both, they have to take into account the severity of the situation. If someone doesn't try to stop Sekhmet, who knows if she'll continue her rampage? Taking a deep breath, the former queen of the gods steps forward into the chamber. Ra, she interrupts, focusing her attention on her grandfather. Sekhmet has been attacking mortals. Isis tries to blot out Set's presence. If she doesn't look at him, then maybe the intense feeling of dread rushing her through her body will go away. She wasn't counting on him being the one to answer her announcement. We know, Set responds flatly. As I was trying to tell your brother, Ross sighs, turning his tired eyes to Isis, everything is under control. Like hell it is, Set snaps. You need to get her on a leash. Isis felt a rush of anger at his words. Hypocrite! The same could be said of you, she coldly points out. She hears the dark deity growl, and she feels his eyes glaring a hole into her hide. She tries to ignore him. What do you mean it's under control? She asks Ra. A deep exhale escapes through her teeth. She had to cool herself down. Set was already agitated enough to cause trouble. She didn't need to be the spark that ignited that powder keg. Sekhmet is merely demonstrating her loyalty, Ra points out. She encountered mortals who spoke against us, and she put them in their place, he explains simply. If the ungrateful mortals are unhappy with our way of doing things, then it is our job to discipline them. Our way? Our job? Set grumbles, seeming quite unamused by their grandfather's choice of words. Isis wasn't quite sure how to feel when she realized she and her brother had similar feelings about Ra's explanation of the problem. The queenly goddess remained quiet for a few seconds as she considered this. She didn't like that she agreed with her husband's murderer, with this brute who she had always viewed as being so savage and mindless. But what was she supposed to think? Was she supposed to just ignorantly agree that Sekhmet's rampage was justified? No. Isis had her own response to the king's statement. Well, who can blame them for being ungrateful, as you seem so keen to put it, she says eventually. They just lost their king. A king they adored. A king that would listen to them. The gods have cut off all major communications with them. No one is telling them why Osiris is gone. Yet they can clearly see that we're all at each other's throats, Isis adds, her voice rising in volume with each word. Her words echo back at her from the boundaries of the massive throne room they all stand within, as if the incorporeal gods of the elements were calling out in agreement with her. It gave Isis the courage to continue speaking, even when she knew she was standing before the highest authority in all of the Duat. We can't act like the mortals are blind and deaf, she resumes. They're not. They may be much less powerful than we are, but we need our worshippers just as much as they need us. We won't be kings, queens, rulers without them underneath us. You built the world, Ra, and all of them are what fills it. If we become violent with the mortals like we have with each other, then we'll have lost everything that makes us what we are, she concludes. Ra's eyes search her for a few moments. He seems to be contemplating his granddaughter's words. He begins to rise from his chair. I agree with Isis, Set manages to choke out. Isis's head snaps in Set's direction. She stares at him incredulously for a few seconds. The dark deity was stubborn and prideful, she knew that. Perhaps swallowing his pride had been the obstacle his voice had been trying to fight around. Ra seems equally as surprised as Isis, and his head turns ever so slightly to look at Set now. Violence has gotten us nowhere, Set concedes. Isis feels as if the world has gone quiet, as if she has gone deaf. She hears nothing but the rush of blood in her ears. She can't hear the emptiness in the dark deity's voice. She looks at him, but she doesn't see the shame etched on his face. All she can recognize is her brother's murderer, her worst enemy, and his hypocrisy. Her shocked face slowly falls into a scowl. "You!" Isis snaps, her voice sharp as a knife. She catches herself, however, and clenches her teeth behind her lips. She can't let this get the better of her. She can't stoop to his level. "You're on thin ice," she hisses through her teeth, glaring at her brother. Set returns her gaze, curling his lip ever so slightly. Just because they agreed on something didn't mean they were on the same side. Ra seems to take a moment to study them, as if he's trying to read their intentions. He sits himself back down on the throne with a deep exhale, and he drums his clawed fingers against the armrests of his throne. "If you two are in agreement about this, then I suppose it's worth reconsideration," he says. He furrows his brow and closes his eyes, looking massively frustrated by this turn of events. "My biggest concern at the moment is keeping the mortals in line." Where is Sekhmet now? Keeping the mortals in line and outright massacring them for foolish words are two very different things, Isis resumes. To her surprise and irritation, it's Set that answers her again, not Ra. "She's still in the city," Set interjects. "That's why I'm here. She wasn't smacking mortals around anymore when I last saw her, but she's prowling around like she plans on it again." "It sounds to me like the problem has solved itself. For the moment," Ra sighs, and he massages his forehead in exasperation. Set opens his mouth to object, but the sun god isn't finished. "If you insist on pressing the issue further, I will have a word with her about her behavior," the old griffin assures. "You can bet your ass I'll be having words with her," Set mutters under his breath, turning away from the throne. He starts to stalk out of the throne room. Isis can tell he clearly isn't happy with Ra's response to their concerns. She doesn't turn her back to him. Even if the dark deity is playing nice for now, she still doesn't want to give him any opportunities to cut her down too. Isis quickly realizes, however, that she isn't the one who would be in immediate danger. Throughout their haphazard appeal to Ra, Nephthys had been staying back near the entrance to the throne room. The poor sorrow goddess had lost her voice in the tense atmosphere, and was now awkwardly awaiting Isis's own departure, so that she herself could leave. As Set makes his way out of the chamber, he pauses a few feet away from his wife. Isis can plainly see that he's looking at her, and, worryingly, he was standing in between the two sisters. If he suddenly turned savage, Isis wouldn't be able to intervene. In realizing this, the queenly goddess feels her blood run cold. She wants to move, but her feet feel as if they're glued to the floor. She couldn't let the dark deity rip her sister away from her too. After a few moments, Set resumes his departure. As he leaves, the dark deity averts his gaze away from Nephthys, and he stares at the floor like a scolded mongrel. Isis sees Nephthys' head turn ever so slightly. She's watching him leave. Had she wanted to say something to him? To reach out? Isis remembers what Nephthys had told her earlier in the day. She had been looking for an opportunity to speak with her husband. But Isis couldn't blame her for losing her voice. Perhaps she'd been scared. Or perhaps she hadn't been sure what to say. It occurred to Isis that, just maybe, Set hadn't been considering attacking Nephthys. Maybe he'd been considering talking to her. Maybe Set wasn't as unreasonable as she thought he was. That didn't mean she trusted him. After Set really leaves, Isis goes over to her sister. "Are you okay?" she asks, reaching out and touching her sister's arm. Isis tries her best to prevent letting on how terrified she'd been, though she can't hide the concern in her voice. "I didn't know what to do," Nephthys quietly replies. Her gaze falls to the floor, and Isis watches as her sister's elven ears droop ever so slightly. I'm sorry for not helping you speak up. I didn't know what to say, Nephthys adds. No, it's okay, Isis assures her right away. Come on. We should go, before he changes his mind.